May 8, 1945 marked the official end of the war in Europe. But beneath the cold Atlantic waters, hundreds of German U-boats continued their patrols, unaware that their Reich had crumbled. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had briefly succeeded Hitler as head of state, transmitted Operation Regenbogen Rainbow, the code ordering all submarine commanders to surface, raise black flags of surrender, and proceed to designated Allied ports. For the men who had terrorized Allied shipping for nearly 6 years, this moment represented not just military defeat, but the end of an era that had seen submarine warfare reach unprecedented levels of sophistication and lethality. The Kriegsmarine had built 1,162 U-boats during the war, and approximately 378 remained operational when Germany surrendered. These steel predators, which had once prowled the Atlantic in devastating wolf packs, now faced an uncertain fate. U-boat crews, many of them young men who had known nothing but war, emerged from their cramped vessels into a world that had fundamentally changed. They had survived where so many of their comrades had perished. German U-boat losses exceeded 70% of all personnel, making it one of the highest casualty rates of any military service in the war. The surrender process itself proved chaotic and emotionally devastating. Some U-boat commanders, unable to accept defeat, chose to scuttle their vessels rather than hand them over to the enemy. Captain Adolf Piening of U-boat 1203 ordered his crew to abandon ship off the Portuguese coast before opening the sea valves, sending his submarine to the ocean floor. Others sailed to neutral ports in Argentina and Indonesia, hoping to escape the Allied dragnet. The vast majority, however, complied with Dönitz's orders, sailing to British, American, Canadian, and Soviet-controlled harbors, where armed guards waited to take possession of Germany's once-feared underwater fleet. British ports witnessed extraordinary scenes as U-boats arrived in long processions. At Loch Eriboll in Scotland, 128 U-boats surrendered between May 9th and 21st. Sailors who had once been hunters now stood on deck as prisoners, watched by the very forces they had attempted to strangle through unrestricted submarine warfare. The submarines represented not just military hardware but years of German engineering excellence. Vessels equipped with schnorkel breathing apparatus, advanced torpedo systems, and in some cases, the revolutionary Type 21 boats that could have changed the course of the war had they arrived earlier. According to documentation preserved in the British National Archives, Allied intelligence teams immediately began cataloging these vessels, recognizing their technical value. The submarines contained secrets worth more than gold: acoustic torpedoes, advanced sonar systems, and hull designs that pushed the boundaries of underwater performance. Each U-boat became a floating library of naval engineering, and the Allies understood that whoever controlled these vessels would gain significant advantages in the emerging Cold War. The question that hung over every naval port from Scotland to Virginia was simple, yet profound. What would happen to these instruments of war now that peace had arrived? November 13, 1945, saw the commencement of Operation Deadlight, the systematic destruction of Germany's submarine fleet. The British Admiralty, in coordination with American and Soviet representatives, had decided that most U-boats would be scuttled in deep Atlantic waters rather than distributed among the victorious powers. This decision reflected both practical concerns and darker psychological needs. The world wanted these weapons of terror erased from existence, sent to the same ocean depths where they had dispatched so many Allied merchant ships and warships. The operation centered on Loch Ryan in southwestern Scotland, where 116 U-boats awaited their fate. British naval crews boarded each submarine, conducted final inspections, and prepared them for their last voyage. Some vessels would be towed to scuttling grounds northwest of Ireland. Others would serve as target practice for Allied warships and aircraft, providing valuable training while simultaneously destroying Germany's underwater capability. The irony was not lost on observers. U-boats that had once hunted British convoys now limped toward destruction, escorted by Royal Navy vessels. Lieutenant Commander James Ferguson of the Royal Navy later described the process in his memoir, noting how German submarines were stripped of anything useful before being prepared for scuttling. Enigma encryption machines, periscopes, torpedo tubes, and navigation equipment were removed and catalogued. The submarines themselves, once gleaming symbols of German naval might, showed the wear of years at sea, corroded hulls, damaged conning towers, and interiors that stank of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and fear. Ferguson wrote that boarding these vessels felt like entering tombs, spaces where young men had lived in claustrophobic conditions for months, never knowing if the next depth charge would crush them like tin cans. The actual sinking proved more difficult than anticipated. U-boats were designed to withstand tremendous pressure and damage. They did not go quietly to their graves. Explosive charges were placed in critical compartments, sea valves were opened, and hulls were breached by gunfire. Yet some submarines took hours to finally slip beneath the waves. U-boat 2501, one of the advanced Type 21 submarines, required multiple explosive charges and sustained gunfire before finally sinking on December 4th. Witnesses reported that the submarine seemed to resist its fate, its bow rising one final time before disappearing into the gray Atlantic. Between November 1945 and February 1946, 116 U-boats were destroyed through Operation Deadlight. They now rest in an underwater graveyard approximately 100 nautical miles northwest of Ireland, at depths reaching 600 feet. This mass scuttling represented the largest deliberate destruction of submarines in naval history, a symbolic purging of the weapon that had nearly brought Britain to its knees. Yet not all U-boats met this fate. The Allied powers had reserved certain vessels for their own purposes, recognizing that these submarines contained technological innovations too valuable to simply sink. January 10, 1946 witnessed a tense meeting in London, where American, British, Soviet, and French naval representatives gathered to divide the remaining German U-boats among the victorious powers. The Tripartite Naval Commission had been established specifically to handle the disposition of Axis naval vessels, and German submarines represented the most contentious issue on their agenda. Each nation wanted access to Germany's advanced submarine technology, particularly the Type 21 and Type 23 boats that incorporated revolutionary design features. The Soviet Union proved most aggressive in its demands. Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov insisted that the USSR deserved the largest share of U-boats as compensation for German atrocities on the Eastern Front. Stalin's regime had suffered catastrophic losses during the war, and Soviet leaders viewed captured German technology as crucial for rebuilding their military capabilities. The British and Americans, however, remained deeply suspicious of Soviet intentions, recognizing that any advanced submarines transferred to the USSR would likely be reverse-engineered and mass-produced, potentially threatening Western naval supremacy in the emerging Cold War. The final agreement, reached after weeks of negotiation, allocated 10 U-boats to each of the 4 major Allied powers, with an additional 10 designated for joint technical study. The United States received some of the most advanced vessels, including U-boat 2513, a Type 21 submarine that could travel submerged at 17 knots, faster than most Allied destroyers. This vessel crossed the Atlantic under American crew in July 1946, sailing from Germany to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where naval engineers eagerly awaited the opportunity to examine its streamlined hull, powerful battery systems, and sophisticated hydraulic controls. Britain selected U-boats that would prove most useful for research purposes, including U-boat 3008, which incorporated experimental rubber coating designed to absorb sonar pulses. British scientists at the Admiralty Research Laboratory in Teddington subjected this coating to exhaustive analysis, seeking to understand how German engineers had attempted to create stealth submarines years before the concept became mainstream. The research derived from captured U-boats would influence British submarine design for decades, contributing to the development of the Porpoise class and later nuclear submarines. France received its allocation with mixed emotions. French ports had served as U-boat bases during the occupation, and many French citizens harbored bitter memories of German submarines operating from Brest, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle. The French Navy incorporated several U-boats into its fleet for training purposes, though these vessels served only briefly before being decommissioned in the early 1950s. According to records maintained by the Service Historique de la Défense in Paris, French submariners found the German boats uncomfortable and outdated compared to emerging designs, yet valuable for understanding enemy tactics and technology that had dominated the Atlantic for so long. March 23, 1946 saw U-boat 3515 arrive at Libau, in Soviet-controlled Latvia, the first of 10 German submarines allocated to the USSR under the tripartite agreement. Soviet naval officers swarmed over the vessel, photographing every detail, measuring every component, and interrogating the German crew members who had been forced to teach their former enemies how to operate the sophisticated machinery. Stalin had ordered Soviet engineers to master German submarine technology as quickly as possible, viewing advanced submarines as essential weapons in the global struggle he anticipated with the capitalist West. The Soviet Union pursued U-boat acquisition more aggressively than any other Allied power. Beyond the official allocation, Soviet forces seized several U-boats in German ports during the final days of the war, including vessels under construction at shipyards in Danzig and Königsberg. Soviet intelligence services also kidnapped key German submarine designers and engineers, transporting them to closed cities where they were compelled to work on Soviet naval projects. These men, separated from their families and country, spent years recreating the technology they had developed for Hitler's Kriegsmarine, now serving Stalin's maritime ambitions. The Type 21 submarines particularly fascinated Soviet naval planners. These boats represented a quantum leap in submarine design. They could remain submerged for extended periods, travel underwater faster than surface ships, and featured streamlined hulls that made them extraordinarily difficult to detect. Soviet engineers at the Central Design Bureau for Marine Engineering in Leningrad worked frantically to reverse engineer every system, from the advanced battery configurations to the hydraulic torpedo reloading mechanisms that allowed rapid-fire attacks. By 1948, the first Soviet-built copies of German U-boats entered service. The Project 611, known in NATO designation as the Zulu class, borrowed heavily from Type 21 design principles. These submarines incorporated German hull forms, diesel-electric propulsion systems similar to those found in U-boats, and even copied details like periscope mechanisms and diving plane configurations. Soviet shipyards in Severodvinsk and Komsomolsk-on-Amur began series production, eventually building 26 Zulu-class submarines that would form the backbone of Soviet underwater forces in the 1950s. The influence of captured German technology extended beyond conventional submarines. When Soviet engineers began developing their first nuclear submarines in the late 1950s, they built upon knowledge gained from studying U-boats. The hull forms, control systems, and acoustic dampening techniques pioneered by German designers during World War II informed Soviet nuclear submarine development. Historical research conducted by naval historian Norman Polmar has documented how extensively Soviet submarine design relied on German foundations, creating an ironic legacy where Nazi engineering ultimately served communist maritime strategy. The U-boats that surrendered in 1945 thus lived on in Soviet vessels that would patrol the Atlantic and Pacific for decades, their genetic lineage visible in every diesel-electric and early nuclear submarine flying the Soviet naval ensign. July 7, 1946 marked the arrival of U-boat 2513 at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire, where American engineers and naval architects assembled to witness the most advanced submarine Germany had produced. The Type 21 vessel, nicknamed the Electroboot, represented everything the United States Navy wanted to understand about cutting-edge submarine warfare. Unlike earlier U-boats that spent most of their time on the surface, diving only to attack or escape, this revolutionary design could operate as a true submarine, remaining underwater for days and traveling at speeds that challenged contemporary anti-submarine defenses. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, who had commanded American submarine operations in the Pacific, led the technical evaluation team. Lockwood recognized immediately that German engineers had solved problems that continued to plague American submarine designers. The streamlined hull form reduced underwater drag dramatically. The massive battery capacity allowed sustained high-speed submerged operations, and the sophisticated hydraulic systems enabled rapid diving and precise depth control. American submarines, which had performed admirably against Japanese shipping, suddenly appeared obsolete when compared to this German achievement. The Portsmouth examination revealed innovations that would reshape American submarine design. German engineers had eliminated external deck guns, reducing drag and allowing the submarine to slip through water more efficiently. They had positioned the conning tower farther forward and flattened its profile, creating less resistance. The battery compartments held 3 times the capacity of American fleet submarines, utilizing improved battery chemistry that American researchers had not yet mastered. Even small details impressed the evaluation team: the efficient galley layout, the improved ventilation systems, and the hydraulic torpedo tube loading mechanism that allowed firing 6 torpedoes in less than 20 minutes. The United States Navy established Project Caesar at Portsmouth to systematically document every aspect of the captured U-boats. Engineers created detailed technical drawings, conducted stress tests on hull sections, and analyzed the metallurgy of critical components. The electric motors were disassembled and studied, revealing German advances in compact, high-efficiency propulsion. The battery cells were subjected to exhaustive testing to understand their superior performance characteristics. According to declassified documents from the Naval History and Heritage Command, Project Caesar produced over 10,000 pages of technical reports that influenced American submarine development for the next 2 decades. The knowledge gained from captured U-boats directly contributed to the development of the Tang-class submarines, commissioned between 1951 and 1952. These vessels incorporated German-inspired streamlined hulls, increased battery capacity, and improved underwater speed. While American designers adapted rather than simply copied German innovations, the influence remained unmistakable. The Tang-class submarines could achieve 16.5 knots submerged, making them the fastest conventional submarines in the American fleet, and validating the German approach to high-speed underwater operations. Beyond immediate technical applications, the captured U-boats influenced American strategic thinking about submarine warfare. The electroboot demonstrated that submarines could transform from vulnerable surface vessels that occasionally dove into true underwater weapons platforms that occasionally surfaced. This conceptual shift proved crucial when the United States began developing nuclear submarines in the 1950s. The USS Nautilus, America's first nuclear submarine commissioned in 1954, incorporated hull forms and control concepts derived partly from German U-boat research, creating a direct technological lineage from Hitler's Kriegsmarine to America's nuclear fleet. August 15, 1946 witnessed the systematic dismantling of U-boat 3008 at the Royal Naval Dockyard in Portsmouth, England, where British scientists conducted what may have been the most thorough analysis of any captured German submarine. The vessel featured experimental anti-sonar coating that had intrigued British researchers since intelligence reports first mentioned its existence in 1944. German engineers had covered sections of the hull with a synthetic rubber compound called alberic, designed to absorb enemy sonar pulses and render the submarine virtually invisible to acoustic detection. The British had reason to take German submarine technology seriously. U-boats had sunk 2,828 Allied merchant ships during the war, totaling 14 million tons of shipping, and had come perilously close to severing Britain's maritime lifelines. The Battle of the Atlantic had been the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, and British naval forces had paid in blood for every advantage gained over German submarines. Now, with access to actual U-boats and the engineers who designed them, British scientists intended to extract every possible lesson from their former adversaries. The Admiralty Research Laboratory established a dedicated U-boat research division that employed over 200 scientists, engineers, and technicians. They approached captured submarines as 3-dimensional textbooks, each component offering insights into German naval engineering philosophy. The snorkel breathing apparatus, which allowed U-boats to run diesel engines while remaining submerged, received particular attention. British submarines had nothing comparable, forcing them to surface regularly for battery charging, a dangerous vulnerability. German crews had used schnorkels effectively during the final years of the war, and British naval designers recognized the necessity of incorporating similar systems into future submarines. The alberic coating research produced unexpected results. British scientists discovered that the synthetic rubber not only absorbed some sonar energy, but also reduced the submarine's own noise signature by dampening vibrations in the hull. This dual benefit made the coating more valuable than initially understood. However, the material proved difficult to manufacture and maintain. It degraded in seawater, peeled off during deep dives, and added weight that reduced the submarine's speed and range. British researchers concluded that while the concept showed promise, practical implementation required materials science advances that would take years to achieve. Beyond technical specifications, British investigators interviewed captured German submarine designers and crew members, seeking to understand the operational philosophy behind U-boat development. These conversations, preserved in Royal Navy archives, revealed how German engineers had embraced radical innovation born of desperation. Facing Allied superiority in surface ships and aircraft, German designers had pursued increasingly sophisticated submarine technology, attempting to create vessels that could operate independently of surface support for extended periods. This philosophy differed fundamentally from British submarine doctrine, which had traditionally viewed submarines as auxiliary vessels, supporting surface fleets rather than as primary strategic weapons. The research conducted on captured U-boats influenced the British submarine development program throughout the 1950s and 60s. The Porpoise-class submarines, introduced in 1956, featured streamlined hulls inspired by German designs and incorporated improved battery systems derived from U-boat technology. When Britain began developing nuclear submarines, engineers at the Royal Naval Scientific Service drew upon German research into hull acoustics, control systems, and crew habitability. Lessons learned from studying vessels designed to remain submerged for weeks at a time in the hostile Atlantic environment. October 3, 1946, brought a complicated emotional moment as U-boat 2518 entered the harbor at Cherbourg, France, sailing under a French naval ensign. This Type 21 submarine had been allocated to France under the tripartite agreement, and French naval officers now commanded a vessel identical to those that had operated from French ports during the German occupation. French citizens who had suffered through 4 years of Nazi control watched with mixed feelings as the submarine, a symbol of their oppression, now served their own navy. The French Navy designated the captured U-boats as the Lobby class, naming them after French submarine officers who had died during the war. U-boat 2518 became the Lobby, while other captured vessels received similarly honorific names meant to reclaim these weapons for French purposes. The submarines served primarily as training vessels, allowing French submariners to study advanced German technology and tactics. However, the French Navy maintained ambivalent attitudes toward these boats. They represented both technological progress and painful memories of occupation and collaboration. French engineers at the Service Technique de Construction et d'Armes Navales in Toulon conducted extensive analysis of the captured submarines, seeking insights that could improve French submarine design. They paid particular attention to the diesel engine configurations, battery ventilation systems, and torpedo storage arrangements. However, France lacked the industrial capacity to immediately implement major submarine construction programs, still recovering from the devastation of occupation and war. The captured U-boats thus served more as educational tools than as templates for immediate copying, unlike the aggressive Soviet reverse engineering program. By 1950, France began retiring the captured German submarines, recognizing that maintaining these aging vessels consumed resources better invested in new construction. Most were scrapped between 1950 and 1953, their useful components salvaged and their hulls cut apart in French shipyards. The brief service of German U-boats under the French flag represented a strange footnote in naval history, weapons of oppression transformed into tools of reconstruction, serving just long enough to transfer knowledge before being consigned to history. Norway presented a different preservation story. The Norwegian government had suffered German occupation from April 1940 to May 1945, and Norwegian merchant shipping had suffered catastrophic losses to U-boat attacks. Yet Norwegian authorities recognized the historical significance of German submarines and chose to preserve U-boat 995 as a museum vessel. This Type 7C submarine, which had operated in Norwegian waters during the war, was towed to Bergen and eventually became part of the Norwegian Naval Museum. The preservation of U-boat 995 allowed future generations to understand the claustrophobic reality of submarine warfare. Visitors could walk through the cramped crew quarters, where 50 men lived for months at a time, see the tiny galley where all meals were prepared, and stand in the control room where life or death decisions were made. The submarine's preservation served educational purposes, helping people understand the technological and human dimensions of the Battle of the Atlantic. Norwegian historians emphasize that preserving the vessel honored not German aggression, but rather the memory of those who had suffered from submarine warfare, ensuring that future generations would remember the cost of conflict. April 21, 1947, witnessed Norwegian salvage teams working in frigid waters near Flensburg, Germany, attempting to raise U-boat wrecks that German crews had deliberately scuttled rather than surrender. When Admiral Dönitz issued Operation Regenbogen, not all U-boat commanders complied. Some chose to send their vessels to the bottom, denying the Allies any benefit from years of German engineering effort. Now, 2 years after the war's end, salvage operations sought to recover these submarines, driven by both the value of their steel and continued interest in their technology. The scale of self-scuttling had been significant. At least 33 U-boats were deliberately sunk by their crews in German harbors during the final days of the war, and dozens more were scuttled at sea. German submariners had opened sea valves, detonated demolition charges, or simply abandoned their vessels with hatches open, allowing them to flood and sink. These acts of defiance represented the final gestures of men who could not accept that their navy, their cause, and their Reich had been utterly defeated. Salvage operations proved technically challenging and economically marginal. Raised U-boats often showed extensive damage from scuttling charges, corrosion from months or years underwater, and contamination from leaking fuel and battery acid. The salvaged submarines were typically scrapped immediately, their steel added to the vast quantities of metal being recycled throughout post-war Europe. However, some vessels yielded valuable components, intact torpedoes, pristine optical equipment, or functioning electronics that had been sealed in watertight compartments. British salvage companies dominated the recovery operations, having developed extensive expertise in raising sunken vessels during and after the war. The Risden Beasley Company and other firms contracted with Allied authorities to clear German harbors of scuttled submarines, both to restore port operations and to recover valuable materials. Workers who raised these submarines reported eerie experiences, entering compartments where German crews had lived their final moments, finding personal belongings scattered throughout the vessels, and occasionally discovering remains of sailors who had chosen to go down with their boats. The environmental impact of scuttled U-boats would not be recognized for decades. Submarines contained numerous toxic substances, diesel fuel, battery acid, hydraulic fluids, and mercury from various instruments. As these vessels corroded on the seafloor, pollutants gradually leaked into the marine environment. By the early 21st century, environmental agencies in Germany, Britain, and Norway had identified numerous U-boat wrecks as potential ecological hazards, requiring monitoring and, in some cases, specialized containment efforts. The U-boats that German crews thought they were hiding from the Allies had become long-term environmental liabilities. Some scuttled U-boats were never recovered and remain on the sea floor to this day. The Baltic Sea alone contains approximately 50 U-boat wrecks, creating a submerged museum of naval history. Sports divers occasionally explore these wrecks, though such activities raise ethical questions about disturbing what are essentially war graves. German authorities have designated certain wrecks as protected sites under maritime heritage laws, attempting to balance historical preservation with respect for the dead and environmental protection concerns. August 17, 1945, brought an unexpected arrival to the port of Mar del Plata, Argentina, when U-boat 530 surfaced offshore and its crew requested asylum. The submarine had left Norway in early May, just before Germany's surrender, and had spent over 3 months crossing the Atlantic underwater, avoiding Allied patrols through careful navigation and extreme conservation of supplies. The arrival shocked Argentine authorities and infuriated the Allies, who demanded the submarine's immediate surrender and the crew's internment as prisoners of war. U-boat 530's journey represented one of several mysterious South American arrivals that fueled decades of speculation about Nazi escape routes. U-boat 977 reached Argentina 2 weeks later, its crew similarly requesting asylum rather than surrendering to Allied authorities. Argentine President Juan Perón, who maintained sympathies toward Axis powers, initially granted the German submariners asylum, though international pressure eventually forced Argentina to hand over both submarines and their crews to American authorities. The arrival of U-boats in South America sparked persistent rumors about Nazi officials using submarines to escape justice. Historical investigations have confirmed that numerous high-ranking Nazis did flee to Argentina and other South American countries after the war, but most traveled via conventional routes, forged documents, commercial shipping, and assistance from sympathetic networks. The submarine arrivals, while factual, represented isolated incidents rather than any systematic evacuation program. Nevertheless, these events contributed to decades of speculation about Hitler's possible survival, hidden Nazi gold, and secret bases in remote locations. The fate of the Argentine U-boats reflected the broader Allied policy toward captured submarines. Both vessels were transported to the United States, where they underwent brief technical evaluation before being sunk as targets during naval exercises. U-boat 530 met its end off the New England coast in December 1947, destroyed by aerial bombing during anti-submarine warfare training. The submarine that had crossed the Atlantic to escape destruction ultimately served the same purpose as its surrendered companions, providing training opportunities for Allied forces preparing for potential Cold War conflicts. Argentina's role in harboring German submarines remained controversial for decades. Historical research published by Argentine historian Uki Gogni has documented how Perón's government actively assisted Nazi fugitives, providing false identities and protection from Allied war crimes investigators. The submarine arrivals represented merely the most visible aspects of Argentina's complicated relationship with defeated Nazi Germany, a relationship that would influence South American politics throughout the Cold War era. December 19, 1949 marked the final chapter of Operation Deadlight, when the last scheduled U-boat was scuttled northwest of Ireland, bringing the total of deliberately destroyed German submarines to 116 vessels. This massive underwater graveyard represented the Allies' determination to eliminate Germany's submarine capability permanently, ensuring that no future German government could resurrect the U-boat threat that had nearly strangled Allied maritime commerce. Yet the impact of German submarine technology extended far beyond these sunken hulls, fundamentally reshaping naval warfare for generations to come. The influence of captured U-boat technology on Cold War submarine development cannot be overstated. American, British, and Soviet submarines built in the 1950s and 60s all incorporated design elements derived from German U-boats: streamlined hulls for improved underwater performance, increased battery capacity for extended submerged operations, and sophisticated sonar absorption techniques. When nuclear propulsion eliminated the need for diesel engines and battery charging, designers still relied on hull forms and control systems developed through studying German submarines. The Type 21 Electroboot's legacy lived on in every nuclear submarine that followed. The Soviet Union extracted maximum value from captured German submarine technology, reverse engineering entire classes of submarines based on German designs. Soviet naval architects freely acknowledged their debt to German engineering, incorporating U-boat features into the Project 611 Zulu class, Project 613 Whiskey class, and even early nuclear submarines. The knowledge forced from German engineers working in Soviet-closed cities contributed to the rapid expansion of Soviet submarine forces, creating the underwater threat that would dominate Western naval planning throughout the Cold War. The environmental legacy of scuttled and destroyed U-boats became increasingly apparent in the early 21st century. Marine scientists discovered that corroding submarine hulls were releasing toxic materials into the ocean, including mercury, lead, and various petroleum products. The Operation Deadlight disposal site northwest of Ireland has been monitored regularly since 2006, with researchers finding elevated heavy metal concentrations in surrounding waters. Similar concerns have emerged regarding U-boats scuttled in the Baltic Sea, where shallower depths and less water circulation concentrate pollution. Modern environmental authorities face the ironic challenge of managing ecological hazards created by a war that ended over 75 years ago. Museums around the world preserve surviving U-boats as historical artifacts. U-boat 995 in Norway, U-boat 2540 in Germany's German Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven, and U-boat 505 at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, allow contemporary visitors to experience the claustrophobic reality of submarine warfare. These preserved vessels serve as powerful educational tools, helping people understand the technological sophistication, human cost, and strategic significance of the Battle of the Atlantic. The story of German U-boats after World War II illustrates how military technology transcends the conflicts that produce it. The submarines that terrorized Allied shipping became the foundation for post-war naval development, their innovations incorporated into the fleets of former enemies. The engineers who designed weapons for Hitler's Kriegsmarine found themselves working for Stalin's Soviet Navy or America's Cold War defense establishment, their expertise valued despite their previous allegiances. The vessels themselves, whether destroyed in Operation Deadlight, preserved in museums, or slowly corroding on the ocean floor, remain tangible links to a conflict that shaped the modern world. The U-boat's final mission proved to be education, teaching subsequent generations about the destructive power of unrestricted submarine warfare and the technological innovations born from desperate circumstances.